Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm excited about this program. We started talking about this, we talk about this all the time, actually, because the model is this amazing little world, and those of us who work with it are really privileged to know even more than we're able to share in the galleries. I think that the model it's both a little world that tells so much about circus history, but it's also a site that we can explore what it means to be a community that works together. The circus, obviously, is that kind of community. And it's this really wonderful reflection, too, of the process of making something and caring for it. So the process of getting the model to the Ringling Museum was one of community, and the ongoing process today and in the future of caring for it is definitely a part of being part of a bigger community. So I want to make clear that we realize that for an hour program, we could only have so many voices represented. But one of the things that I love about the museum is that something like the model requires the work of everybody there. Every department has its role to play in our ability to represent the model and present it to the world. So I'm joined today by some of my colleagues from the collection side who actually help with the physical care and exhibit of the model. And so we're going to try and share a little bit about how our interactions with this model explain our professional roles at the museum. So, and I'm going to try and always click the right button. There we go. So I am Jennifer Limmer Posey. I noticed a lot of familiar faces and a lot of familiar names as you all logged in. And I'm grateful to have you all here. Many of you do know me. I'm the Tibbles Curator of Circus. And I've been in that position for about 2 years now, but I have been at the museum for 18 years, and it's been largely working with the model and with the circus collection. So I wanted to start out by giving an introduction to what does a curator do. And I think a lot of people could find many different ways to explain this. But for me, what a curator does is they are a bridge. They are the person that takes an object and the ideas that it represents and interfaces that out into the world. So in a public facing way, that's all about the interpretation we do. It's about the way that we write labels, the exhibits that we bring together and the connections we make. It's also about publications or even public programs like we're doing today. And internally, I think we have just as important of a role in advocating for stewardship and making sure that the collections that we care for are understood by our colleagues within the museum. And even for me, I want colleagues to kind of fall in love with the magic of these collections, because everything that we have chosen to take care of at the museum represents an array of stories. And so part of my job, I think, is passing those stories on to others. I chose this picture. I'm going to do a little aside. I was trying to figure out what would be a good image to go with curator. And in the model, there are so many little stories that play out. This particular figure, I'm sure many of you do know, is the Equestrian Mayworth. She was a 20th century center ring star of the Ringling Circus. She rode bareback acts and she could do a somersault from the back of one riding horse to another. Amazing feats of strength and agility and talent. And she's washing her hair in the model. And I have to admit, I've never said this to Howard, but I think he knows. For a long time, I was a little bit sad that someone of such great prestige was washing her hair instead of showing off all of her skills, right? These amazing acts that she could do. And we find her in the back lot in this very everyday scene. But I was explaining one day to a visitor how this came to be. And the reality is Howard met Mayworth. May was in her late 70s, and he sat beside her on a bus one day. He was much younger, but had been working on the model for quite a long time. And he asked her, "What do you remember about the circus?" And she really didn't have a lot of very specific memories that helped Howard, who was very driven about, how many poles did a tent have and these kind of very specific pieces of information. But what she did tell him was that every day on the circus lot, she was privileged enough to get 2 buckets of water. And that meant that she could wash her hair. And she also was able to carry her pet parrot with her on the show. And when you stop and think about it, what Howard did was honor Mayworth's story. He found the truth of what she remembered. It was part of the bigger picture of the circus, and he let that play out in his model. So I try to carry that with me, that the job that I do is about honoring people's stories and letting their voices speak for themselves. Oh. So I did learn almost everything I know about circus from Howard and his model and his collections. When I started this position, I knew nothing about circus history. I had studied art history. And I was hired to help document Howard's collection of photographs and posters. And so because of that, I actually encountered the model long before it was installed at the museum. It was still in Tennessee. And I went up and met Howard Tibbles, and I was very intimidated because he's so smart and he knew so much and I knew nothing. And he said to me, "Draw me a clown." So that was my very first interaction with Howard, was he demanded that I draw him a clown. And I think because I was game enough to do that, he decided I was all right. And then I asked good questions. And that's what Howard has done throughout building this model, is he's taken the time to ask good questions, to explore the materials he's collected, and to learn about every aspect as he built the model. So for me as a curator, I've learned a lot about my process from Howard and from the community that I've become connected with. I wanted to just show a quick background about the model. Howard fell in love with the circus when he was 6 years old, and he started, as he calls it, playing circus at age 12. So you see in the upper corner a picture of him in his grandparents' backyard with one of his early versions of a model circus. And then in the lower corner, that's Howard in 1982 presenting the model at the World's Fair in Knoxville. So since the 70s, the model has been presented in different locations, but it's always been growing. It's been added to over the years. So it's today it stands as something much bigger than it ever was when it was displayed anywhere else. It came to the museum, well, it arrived via truck in 2004. And that summer, the whole circus train was unloaded in the Tibbles Learning Center. I am very cognizant now that I am the last of the staff member who were actively participating in the installation of the model. So it's important to me to record a lot of these memories, and these kind of programs help with that process. It was magical to watch this circus roll into town. The flat cars were put on the tracks, the wagons were loaded onto the flat cars, and all of the equipment for the circus was there in those wagons, just like the real circus traveled. I included in this slide a picture of just a handful of the volunteers who have worked with us installing the model and caring for it over the years. You can see Pete and Shirley Adams and Don and Carolyn McGarvey, who are all still working with the museum in various capacities. They are in the bottom corner adding plates to the bottoms of model figures. That was one of their later volunteer tasks, and they would sit and do that for hours. Before that, all of the men had undertaken what you see going on in the top corner. And this is one of these weird backstories of the model, but I think it explains a lot about Howard and the meticulousness that he put into it. When Howard had displayed the model elsewhere, he had put together rail pretty quickly. And so he had laid the rail directly on the wooden ties, but that's not right. If you know anything about railroads, the rail is actually put on top of a metal plate, which you can see in the lower corner. It's called a tie plate, and that is the interface between the wooden tie and the metal rail. It helps keep the rail stable so it doesn't get wiggled in the wooden tie and come loose. So it couldn't stay incorrect for this installation because this was the permanent home of the Howard brothers model. So he had his volunteer corps work tirelessly. I mean, literally a few weeks they spent pulling up the rail, filling in all of the holes left by the spikes with small toothpicks, and then putting the rail back down with the ties. To this day, they tell me about how much time they spent filling tiny holes with toothpicks, but it's become a fond memory, and it's a statement about how important accuracy is within this model. I did not want to pass by in talking about the community of people who have helped Howard with the model without mentioning David Duncan as well. David Duncan is a longtime friend of the Tibbles, but he's a railroad historian, and he has continued to work with Howard. In fact, this scene, I think, is probably about 5 years ago. They were adding a small rest tent down here near the parking lot. So David has been really instrumental in helping Howard continue to fulfill his vision of the Howard Brothers Circus model. I think much like I was saying about the museum being a community, this model, while it is all very much driven by Howard's vision and by his desire for complete accuracy, it would never have been possible for him to do everything that you see there all by himself. His focus was always on the wagons and the tents and the logistical side. And then he's had people who have helped him fulfill other parts of his vision over the years. And David's certainly been an instrumental part of that and continues to this day. So for us at the museum, he's a tremendous resource because he can tell us a lot about what's in the model. So after the train was unloaded, we started setting up, really Howard started setting up the tents. So this picture was taken in the summer of 2004, and you can see the big top has been set up. If you look really closely, you can see that the stakes along this side, along the back side of the tent, have been tied off already, but around the front, the strings are still loose. So every one of those stakes was tied off by Howard with exactly the same kind of hitch knot that they would use on the circus lot, which is pretty amazing. Down in this corner, the menagerie tent is waiting for its poles. And over on the other side of the model, Janice Tibbles is very carefully placing items in the dressing tent. So, oh, I skipped the best picture. This is what she was working with. It cannot be said enough that most of the little pieces, most of the more than 45,000 individual pieces in the model are just that, are individual pieces. So you can see the little piles here of hand mirrors and tissue boxes and other sundries that are used to set up on top of the performers' trunks. Every one of those is loosely set on top of the trunks, and then the trunks were moved into place within the model. So this little world is complete with all of these details because of the time and efforts that went into it. So back to my side, as we were watching the model be installed by Howard and all of the people who were helping him, on the curatorial side, Debbie Walk, who was curator of circus at the time, myself and others were thinking about how we could use the model to really reflect moments in history, to correlate one to one and to bring history to life within the model. And so that's an ongoing pursuit. The model offers endless possibilities for telling stories specifically about circus. And as I love, it's a great place to tell stories about specific people. So this clown is inside the big top. His name, historic name, was Paul Wenzel. And he was a tremendously talented producing clown. He would build props for himself and others. He started clowning with American tented shows in the 1920s. He's actually represented in the Glazier collection of photographs from the early 20th century. Howard would have used this image that's part of the Tibbles collection in order to build the model piece. So you can see Paul is got these giant shoes that are like roller skates, and allegedly he is being pulled by this lovely goose. A number of years ago, Toby Ballantyne, whose father Bill Ballantyne clowned with Paul Wenzel, brought us this lovely goose, which is exactly the one that you see on the circus lot and exactly the one that you find within the model. And that's just one of countless examples of places where the miniature that's represented there in the model comes to life in full size for us in the circus collections. I could go on all day pointing out these kinds of stories, but the point is that the model is a site of the world, of history, of stories that can connect to almost anything if we try hard enough. But it is an object that requires a great deal of care. And a lot of that care are things that you would never imagine. So the rest of this program is an opportunity for my colleagues who are a little more hidden in the work that they do relative to the model to talk about their parts in that. So I'm going to turn it over to Glenn Hendrick, and he can talk about how he keeps the model running.
Hi, everybody. Uh, my name is Glenn. I'm the exhibit technician for the Tibbles Learning Center and the Circus Museum. And I'm going to tell you about a couple of things that I do on a daily basis to help maintain the Howard Brothers Circus model. So there's a lot to it. I help maintain the lighting. There's both the lighting inside the model, tiny bulbs for the street lamps and inside the big top and all that sort of thing. And the display lighting that, lets you all see the model when you come in. I maintain audio video components. I install additional model pieces when they're made by the model makers and Howard. I make modifications to the actual environment to make it easier to do my work. So in this picture, you can see I'm poking my head through a access hatch right behind the menagerie tent. I'm right there where the elephants are training, and there's a couple other access points like that. And so that's sort of the physical access. I help manage that. And then I do housekeeping also. So picking up lizard skeletons when we get the occasional one of those, and other little things, just cleaning up inside the environment there. I also help with all of the displays in the Historic Circus Museum and Tibbles Learning Center, and putting up the displays of Howard Tibbles' collection, for instance, of his posters, of the advertising materials from the circus, and the Ringling Museum's collection of all of that as well. So I work hand in hand with Jennifer on the actual material inside the museum. So as you can see, where I'm sticking up my head, I'm right there at the level of the green felt. So that's the tabletop that you see that makes up the environment of the circus. But I'm going to talk first about the underground. So if we go to the next slide, you can see that just below that surface, there is a big basement under the big top there. It's about 3,200 square feet, and it's about 8 feet tall, and it is invisible to everybody, but this is what gives me access in multiple different places to do work on the model. So there's electrical equipment, there is a fire suppression system, there's wiring for all of the lighting inside the model and the AV equipment, and even just bulky stuff like this, like a staircase to get up to and scaffolding to work off of. So this is the world that I work in most of the time. And from right here, this scaffolding, we saw a picture of Howard earlier sitting inside the big top, and this is where he was sitting when he did that. And if we could go to the next picture, thank you. If he looked up from where he was, he would see one of these chandeliers that would have been the big can lights that the circus used to light the inside of the big top during their performances. And, these would be big industrial sized lights in reality, but they're less than an inch long in my world. And you can see all the little obstacles in my way there. There's rigging for all the trapeze artists, and the performers are hanging out up there in the space. And I have to get in there and reach past all of that to change these lights. So I maintain all of this and the street lights on the outside of the tent. And as well as that, there's the display lighting, which we can see in the next picture. Up around the top edge of this photo, you can see a bunch of glaring lights. And these go through a daylight nightlight cycle where they dim down to 20% of their capacity and come back up. And as they're doing that, the lights in the town and inside the circus come on, and it gives you a sense of life of the circus, that you see it go through this daytime nighttime cycle. So I maintain those. There's a theater lighting controller that handles this, and so that's part of my job, is changing out these lights. We use a good quality light bulb that has a high color rendering index to give you all the rich colors from the materials that they used inside of the model. And so I source all those parts and replace them and maintain the equipment that controls them. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see some of that. So this is the controller that Howard built to automate the circus. And on the right-hand side, you can see it just looks like basically a file cabinet or a tool cabinet or something in the basement. But when you open it up, the image here in the middle is what you see inside, and it is a lot of wire. There's AC power supply, there's DC power supplies, all of these different little bulbs run on different voltages depending on where they are and what sort of color they want. There's dimmers and switches all through that. And this is a very dependable system that was built. It's very, I would call it like electromechanical as opposed to really computerized. So it's very dependable. I rarely have to do anything inside of it at all. It's very well built, and I imagine that Howard probably took some of his, I see a question there about his educational background. I know that he had experience in his family's flooring mill, and I believe he's a trained engineer. And so I'm sure that he used some of his experience from that, because this is very much like an industrial control system. Do the lights degrade the color of the model over time? Yes, lights do damage to materials over time. And that's something that, that we work with conservation on, which is what Emily does. And, you know, that's been installed here for 15 years almost. And, you know, that damage is going to continue to accumulate over time. But we use good high quality lights with, you know, and it's on for a certain period of time, but off a lot also. So I like to think that that'll lengthen the amount of time that everything will survive in there under these conditions. And we replace parts as they take damage. At least at this point we do. It's still a work in progress and a living model. So the heart of this controller is the PLC, a programmable logic controller. And if we go to the next slide, you can see this. And again, I'm sure that Howard's experience with the mill and his education as an engineer, these were the kind of controllers that are used to control industrial automation equipment in those kinds of environments. And again, they're very, very dependable. They connect to a lot of other equipment, turn on and off other controllers. And they control the lighting, but there's also some other aspects you see, like the motion inside of the model. So if we go to the next slide, you'll see, here's a couple of the spare motors. And they turn, the one with the triangle shape on the top of it there, or Y shape on top of it there, turns one of the rings of the circus. It's a 3-ring circus inside of the big top. And the other one on the other side turns another smaller display that's off to the side. And these are just a couple spare parts I wanted to show. And you'll see in the next slide what they do. Up here at the left, you see an exotic animal training act. This is one of the rings of the circus. And we've got a couple of camels there, a zebra, and looks like some llamas, and a show pony. And this at the bottom right-hand side there is one of the motors that we saw. This one's actually being replaced right now, which is why I had that picture of it sitting out on the table. This piece turns the whole tabletop that you see. And again, this is located on the scaffolding, just above the scaffolding where we saw before, that's down in the basement underneath the big top. So that gives the life to the show. This controller sends a signal, tells this motor to turn, and it turns for about 1 minute out of 8 minutes during the time that it's being presented. It gives you a little surprise when you walk up to the front there, and then all of a sudden you see things come to life under the big top. In the next slide, we'll see another one. This little guy with the top hat on the bottom right-hand side, he is spinning a rope, and at the top left, you can see a web performer, and she is holding onto that rope and being spun around. There's, I think, 16 of them throughout the big top. And this was part of the performance in reality, but it's an illusion in the model, obviously. And in the next photo, you can see the little motor that does all of the actual work. And this is, again, mounted right underneath the big top, and it connects to the bottom of that rope. And you know, again, for about a minute out of every 8 or 10 minutes, this spins and again, brings the performance to life. And here are a couple of more pieces. There's a AV controller, this whole rack on the left-hand side. And this automates audiovisual experiences throughout the entire display, not just inside the model, but throughout the entire Tibbles Learning Center. So there's informational videos with advertising, or just displays of performances throughout. And there's a catalog of digitized posters you can look through, and sounds like the sound of a lion roaring, and the sounds of the crowd on the midway that you hear as you walk around the model. They're controlled with controllers like this. And I heard somebody, or I saw somebody in the chat earlier mention the video of the chef flipping the pancakes. And on the top right here, that's a little, that's a screen that I'm testing to replace one of the screens inside the model. And that's the video of the chef flipping the pancakes. And again, you walk up to this little featured scene, which is the hotel where everybody's eating on the set of the model. And when you walk up to this tent, you also see this little video from the actual time. So again, it gives it a nice touch of the real life of the circus. So that's most of the real automated equipment that I work with. But beyond that, one of my favorite things to do inside the model is that I get to help the model makers and Howard put the new pieces in. So this is when I get to climb up onto the top of the tabletop. And here's a couple of the pieces that David Duncan, the train historian and friend of Howard's, made. There's a little cast iron stove and a sink, and I believe that's a coal closet from inside of a Pullman train car. And he brought these pieces in and we photographed them in the archives for our records. And then he finishes installing them inside the Pullman train car. And when he's ready, I'll help him bring that train car inside and put it on the train tracks, and we'll wire it up to the lighting system and make it into part of the model, just like everything else that's been installed. And in addition to the new pieces that go in, there's a little bit of maintenance that I do with the older pieces. If we can see the next slide. Here is one of the figurines that was installed years ago, and right in the middle of the scene there, you can see he is falling down on the job. And this happens from time to time. So then I'll go in and I report this to conservation. I let them know that something happened, and I'll climb into the menagerie tent, and there's a little hatch in the back that David Duncan and I cut so that we can pull that out and come up right inside the tent, and I'll grab this piece and bring him out, and then we'll repair him and bring him back to his family eventually. So that more or less wraps up what I do with the model.
I'm going to jump back in. This is Jennifer again. Thank you, Glenn. I cannot understate how much work goes into keeping the model up and running. Glenn always has some other piece that needs to be fixed or corrected, or a light that needs changing, and changing lights is not necessarily an easy thing to do when you're talking about getting inside of the model space. As we kind of step back from looking at the big environment that is the model, I wanted to, thank Glenn for the work that he does, and then tell a little bit about when the model was installed. We recognized that this was going to become this giant environment, but it's an environment made up of tens of thousands of individual pieces. And so as Howard was installing each piece of the model, we had staff who were actually taking photographs and cataloging the pieces so that we would be able to track them and to care for them. That was a huge task, monumental, 42,000 plus individual pieces. And we have a lot of documentation that still is being processed. So I wanted to share just one thing, because again, it's about the magic of the model. This is the Red Ticket Wagon that you just saw on the lot. You can see all the doors are closed. There's a handle. All of this is modeled perfectly after the historic wagon. When you open up the door, there's actually a screen door that still had a passageway to exchange money there. The steps have folded down. Windows open up on front and sides. And then the screen door can fold in to open just like the real wagon. Inside the Red Ticket Wagon, which has its top on, and our visitors will never, ever see this. Inside at those ticket windows, there are these little sets of drawers, and inside the drawers are money, and inside the cabinets are books, and there are little benches for the figures that are now installed in that wagon. On the opposite end of the ticket wagon, I think this is one of my favorite secrets of the whole model. It is in the model book, so some of you may have seen this wonderful array of cabinets and tiny drawers that were made to function just like their real counterparts, and again, are actually filled with items. So those magical aspects of detail may be hidden, but I think they still kind of shine through when people experience the model. That depth and breadth of it, it really does resonate. So for us as staff, it was really important to capture everything that made that possible. So every little piece, even the little tiny bills, were photographed and were measured and given information. And then honestly, because museum life is busy, that information was compiled and set on a drive and has been waiting for people to have a little more time, which as one bright spot of quarantine, we had a little more time. And we also had a wonderful new associate in the registration office. Walker Babbage is going to join us and talk about his role in helping to catalog and care for the model. So Walker, it's all yours.
Sure, thanks, Jennifer, and good morning, everyone. My name is Walker. I am an associate registrar. I work in the registration department, and if you are unfamiliar with registration, or specifically museum registration, essentially, short answer is we are record keepers. As a department, we maintain the records of accession, track locations of objects, internal and external, as well as the logistics for object acquisitions, exhibitions, and incoming and outgoing loans. And so to do that job, we use a collections database and collections database software that is called the Museum System, or TMS for short. And if we go to the next slide, we'll see a snapshot of TMS. This is one particular view of TMS. And I pulled up some of the ticket wagons, the red wagons, as an example. So what we'll see here is approximately 21 objects. Each thumbnail is a single object, and below each thumbnail, you'll see a blue bar. And on that is that unique object number, as well as any associated media on file. So this is one particular view of TMS, but before we even got to this point, if we go to the next slide, we'll see what Jennifer was talking about. So in previous years, the model pieces were photographed. We'll see on the left-hand side or one of the red ticket wagons, or red wagons, but this one is covered in canvas, just one of the shots that we had. But all the pieces were photographed, and if you see in the lower right-hand side, it might not be the best resolution, but there's a card. And on that card is the object number, namely, but also just information about the object that was then translated into the right-hand side in the Microsoft Access database. And so that's a cropped image, so it's not everything, but you can get a sense of what we did capture, such as the medium, or mediums in this case, titles, object name, etc. So that was all compiled, and these were separate as existing in the Microsoft Access database and just the separate image files. And with the help of Jennifer and Glenn, we've begun importing these into the museum system en masse, and we're a bit over 5,000 individual object records with hundreds and hundreds of corresponding media images. But that is quite a process, as Jennifer hinted at. There's a bit of cleanup beforehand of the data, the images, and then after the fact, once they're in the database, there's cleanup of those records. We're kind of limited in what we can import en masse, so there's just updating the information that isn't present. So if we hop over to the next slide, we can see a snapshot of a TMS record. So this is the collections database software that we use, and this is the number 123 Red Ticket Wagon. And this is just a very basic data view in TMS, but it gives you object metadata like the classification, the title, medium, everything we saw in the Access database. But I did want to point out in the bottom right, it's kind of hard to see, but the location. We track the current location as well as previous locations. But that's one thing we're working towards in the model, is how do you keep track of all these individual pieces? There's many. It's very difficult to track, and with the collection alone, it's difficult. So that's where we come in as registration and the collections database software. And I did just want to talk about the directions that we're going with this project and also our department. So if we go to the next slide, we'll see what is called e-museum, and that's the electronic museum, the Ringling e-museum. And if you haven't visited this before, it's public. It's emuseum.ringling.org. And essentially, this is a snapshot of our collections database. So anything that we want to publish, we can. That'll be pushed out to eMuseum with their object information and their images. The one that we're currently looking at, this object record does predate our current project, so it will be updated, but this is a good example because, for one, this is eMuseum. This is how we want to display information, but in the museum system, we're able to sort of group objects or create relationships. In TMS, what's called, parent-child relationships. There's other types, but in this case, the menagerie tent would be a relationship with all the objects inside of it. You can see on the right-hand side pane of eMuseum the relationships, the model area, and then the area object. So on eMuseum, you will be able to view the contents of that particular section, the menagerie tent in this case. As the project progresses, all those very minute details like the shots of the money, the insides of the wagon, that will all be published on eMuseum to allow the public or scholarly research to view these perspectives that you can't view in person. So that's the direction we want to head in as registration, working on the model, and that's my introduction to the model as well. The next slide, my last one, just sort of highlights what we've been talking about. In registration, we want to maintain that model information, of course, importing and updating the object records that we do have, but of course information and new media is taken, so that's updating existing records, but also making it publicly accessible, and that's the eMuseum portal. And all of this has come about through working across the institution. There's a wealth of information in every department. So collections has been working with archives, library, just to complete fuller records in our database, but also publish them for the public, but just to give the most information that we can. I saw a question about the eMuseum. Our eMuseum website, I will put it in the chat, but it is emuseum.ringling.org. It should be found on the website as well, but we can make sure everyone has that link. It's not the entire collection. It's everything that we've deemed viewable by the public, so we want the most complete records. But it's a great utility, and we've been greatly trying to improve that. But that's my introduction with the model. It's been great working with Jennifer and Glenn, and I am looking forward to continuing to do that.
That's great. Thank you, Walker. I just want to chime in on Walker's portion of it, because I think a lot of times we underestimate that kind of document keeping. It's rote work. It takes a lot of attention, and I really am grateful to Walker for managing that in a way that it's going into the database, because ultimately what that will mean for us, you saw the eMuseum, within that facet as well as the database itself, we'll be able to make connections. Some of the historic images that I showed in relationship to the model, we can begin to tie those together in ways that someone down the road who never knew Howard, never met me, can still see the relationships. So it's a tremendous tool, and it is making its way for the future. But the future is pointless unless we have the model itself there for everyone to see. And so that is the newest of our colleagues that is part of this conversation. Emily Brown is going to talk to us about conservation concerns and the model. So Emily?
Hi, I'm really great. It's really great to be part of this little virtual program. I'm Emily Brown. I'm the conservator of decorative arts and sculpture, and I am the newest staff member, one of the newest staff members in the collections department recently. I was hired last December, so I'm just really starting to get to know the model in many ways. I'm responsible for the care of three-dimensional objects at the Ringling, and I am the first staff conservator, objects conservator here. So I'm setting a lot of things up. Just to briefly, conservation is the preservation and restoration of artworks and objects of cultural heritage. And as a conservator, I utilize science, art history, studio art skills, and ethics to understand materials and the materials of art and their deterioration. And I also use these to choose the most appropriate repair materials and methods used to stabilize objects. So next slide. So there are so many materials that are part of this model. As Jennifer and Glenn have already talked about, there are plastics and wood and textiles and paint and electronics. This complexity makes for a significant challenge in preservation. We already got a question over the chat about lighting and lights deteriorating colors. That is absolutely true. And that's something that we have to balance with presentation and long-term preservation. Another example is plastics make up a large portion of the materials that are in this model. And plastics deteriorate very quickly sometimes in some very strange ways. And we don't really have currently a great solution to arrest the deterioration of plastics. And when plastics deteriorate, they can off-gas acidic vapors that can cause other materials around them to degrade. For instance, metals that are in close proximity can begin to corrode based on the deterioration of another material. So from the very practical standpoint of what is it to be a conservator for the Tibble circus model, it's enormous because there is the front side that everybody sees, the public sees, and then there's the back side, which Glenn introduced us to, which is 3,200 square feet of electronical equipment. And you know, working with Glenn, who is the day-to-day eyes and ears on the ground, who is day-to-day maintaining this model, when other issues arise, such as figures that fall from their little stands, and what is the best way to repair those, that's where conservation starts to step into play. So if we go to the next slide. So as I said, there are a lot of materials in this collection, and what I'm going back to one of Walker's slides of the museum system database, and capturing all of that accurately in the museum database is also part of my responsibilities. And you can see in here acrylic paint, brass, cotton, and the catch-all plastic. And there are lots of different types of plastic that deteriorate in very different ways. So the more specificity that we have about materials and that we can document accurately is hugely important. And that takes a lot of time, and in a lot of ways, a lot of scientific investigation and analysis as well. So if we go to the next slide. Another aspect of the conservation of this model, I'm going to bring it full circle back here to Howard Tibbles, is thinking about you know, the appropriate approach to conserving a model this complex with this kind of automation and all of these mechanical approaches. Is what is the intent of Howard, what is Howard's intent for the presentation of his work? And Jennifer talked earlier about his vision for the model. And there is definitely a vision for the model. And understanding that as, you know, from the curatorial aspect helps me as a conservator to understand what are the priorities here and where are we going to put our energies in, because there are a lot of things that we can spend time caring for and preserving, but really prioritizing things can make the decision about what to treat and how to treat it more appropriate, you know, for this material. So for instance, we saw earlier, there are so many figures in this model, and some are very specific people. We saw Paul Wenzel, we saw several performers who were very specific people with very specific scenes and stories. This is an image of another very specific scene and two very specific figures who I believe are made in the likeness of Howard's parents. So there are a lot of figures in this model that represent general spectators. But knowing that there are certain figures in this model, just to pick out the figures, let alone all of the, you know, train cars and all of the little objects inside the train cars, you know, if we're just going to look at the figures, which of the figures do we prioritize in maybe treatment? Maybe we treat them a little bit differently than we might treat another set of figures. That also is part of what I do as a conservator stepping in, is to really think about artist's intent. And this is, and since I am so new, we have yet to have a lot of these discussions amongst ourselves and with colleagues, but I think that there is, you know, definitely room to be had to have discussions about deterioration of colors and fading of colors. I think the circus is meant to be bright, in my opinion, and I think Howard would want his circus to be bright. So how do we balance fading colors and replacing parts with the preservation of the original materials in an object? These are really big questions that are some of the ones that I hopefully will try to help answer in the coming years. But it's, you know, and I, like Jennifer, really enjoy the stories that objects tell. One of the main reasons why I went into conservation was the fact that preserving one object can tell so many stories. And it's kind of amazing that this model has 45,000 tiny little objects to tell so many stories. So that's my part.
Thank you so much, Emily. So I'm going to swing back a little full circle as well to that idea of stewardship. And it is one of the most important things to me that I can do in my position as curator of circus is to make sure that we as a museum are celebrating these objects and preserving them and sharing them in a way that continues to make them relevant and meaningful. I mentioned that I'm the last staff member who was actively part of the model installation. That's something I think about a lot, but I have been so delighted to build relationships with the three colleagues here, as well as many others across the museum, because I see that we are set to pass on this information and to continue celebrating the magic of the Howard Brothers circus model and of Howard Tibbles and his story, because that's part of what brings the magic, is the way that one individual was mesmerized by the circus. His story is a link to keep circus history very potent and relevant to our communities. So I think that's all of our program. I know we've run a little long, but I think we're happy to entertain some questions. I have not been monitoring the chat, so let me go into that. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. So we can go.
And Jennifer, one question that came up early on was talking a little bit more about Howard's background and his motivation for creating the model. So maybe since you were just talking about Howard, that would be a good time to answer that one.
Sure. I honestly had intended to do even more of that in the program, but obviously we had a lot of ground to cover. So Howard was never with the circus. I think that's always a question that comes up. he has memories of seeing the circus as a young child, even age 6, can remember acts that he saw, but more than anything, what he remembers is seeing a city spring up out of canvas overnight. The magic of the logistics really spoke to his engineering mind. I think he always wanted to conquer understanding how that was possible. How could this city of people, of more than 1,500 people moving every single day, how could that happen? So he started building the model, and he started the model that's installed at the Tibbles Learning Center. The first pieces were made in 1956, which coincidentally is the year that Ringling stopped traveling under canvas. And Howard was in college. He was very young. He devoted himself from that point forward. He is still making model pieces today. It is who he is. And I can't speak enough of how the magic that he sees in the circus is what can inspire. It's what inspired me. It's what can inspire others to really appreciate the stories that we share in the museum. Did that cover some of it, Laura?
Yeah, totally.
Good.
I think another question that came up from several different people were different iterations of how can we provide all this insider information to the visitor as they're looking at the model. There's a lot that they just can't see. There was a question about, do we have any future plans for high-tech experiences, like anything that's virtual or PowerPoint images or ways to elevate the stories of the performers? So I don't know, Jennifer, if you want to speak to that a little bit.
I will try. That's a great question, because there's so many different ways to go about it. And at the same time, in talking to people who work on the circus, who do the lighting and those kinds of things, they always are a little hesitant to let people know of their roles, because there's something magic that happens when all of the things that, say, Glenn is managing, all of those lights and motors, and when those things all work effortlessly, that the world is complete inside the model. So in some ways, you don't want to expose too much of it there in the gallery, because I think it would take away in a sense. And honestly, it would slow people down. In high season, in normal times, people are shoulder to shoulder experiencing that. But I do think programs like this help us do it. The work that Walker is doing with TMS and the ultimate way it can feed into eMuseum, I see very much as an opportunity to start threading stories together, to connect individual biographies, but also to tell more about how model pieces were made. We have in the collection a car that Howard was modeling. It's a Rio, an REO wagon, and he built one. It's actually on the model, and it's been painted. It's supposed to be used to carry people back and forth from the railroad to the circus lot. But we have one that's not painted. And that's one that ultimately we need to put on display so that people can not see it as part of a scene, but can see the craftsmanship and the beauty of the work that was done to create this one individual piece. So we're always looking at ways to expand that story.
If I can say also, part of it is in the context that the model is displayed in. If you come to the Tibbles Learning Center and come around and see the other displays that are here surrounding the model and in the Historic Circus Museum as well, there obviously a lot of the story is told there.
Yeah, it is always shifting. We learn more. I have seen that model from the moment that the pack trains arrived on the table. And a few months ago, I was walking through and I looked in the backyard part of the circus at these little tiny red wagons. They've got bars on them and they're very small. They're about a quarter the size of an average wagon. And I realized I had no idea when those had been put on the table. I couldn't quite bring myself to think of them. And I asked Howard about them. And they're what are called transfer cages to move big cats from the wagons that they traveled in into the big top. And he said, well, they've been there all along. But I just had never registered them because there's so much richness. So, even for me, every day is an opportunity to learn and think about the model in a new way.
We've got two sort of logistical questions. One is, how do you dust the model? And two is, how are the figurines secured to the floor?
Okay, dusting the model, there's actually there's a high-tech solution to that. It's a positive pressure environment. The air pressure inside of the glass in the model is actually just a little bit higher than the pressure in the outside and regular atmospheric pressure. And it just kind of keeps all the dust out. It works surprisingly well. And even as far, I mentioned lizards earlier, there are sometimes little creatures that I have to pull out of there, but it's a very well-controlled environment. It's surprisingly easy to manage everything. Now I do go in with a little vacuum from time to time, and a vacuum with a HEPA filter on it, and I pick up a little bit here and there. And we're always cleaning the glass on the outside of it. There's constant maintenance, but it's a well-designed system. And the other one I see there is how are the figures secured to the floor, and some of them do actually have holes through the floor with little pegs that actually go into the wood of the tabletop, but almost all, or little pins, but almost everything is actually on a base. It's got a little aluminum base or a plastic base glued to the bottom of the figure, and so they just stand up on their own.
So I'm going to jump in because this is an opportunity for me to share one more piece of information with, probably Emily will like this the most, but Glenn, you too. The model table is actually covered in a pressed board, a pressed paper board. Mm-hmm. So there's wood, and then there's the paper board, and then there is the felt. So the pins go into that paper board. All of that, including the environment, was Howard's vision. Howard was an integral part in planning that building as a space for the model. So the pressurized atmosphere, the way the model unfolds in a J so that you're not overwhelmed by seeing all of it at once, that it opens up to you. That was all Howard, and it came from the years of showing and knowing what was going to be necessary to keep it up. The dusting was a huge deal, and I will say you can go in there and you can run a gloved finger on top of a wagon and you won't pick up dust. It's amazing. It's been there 15 years. So it's really incredible that it's done so well. I had seen one other question along the way about the individual figures in the model and whether they were each unique. And that goes back to the fact that Howard recognized very early on that he could not make the whole world that he imagined all by himself. He did carve some figures in the model. The band inside the big top, Howard carved. And there are some performers on the back lot that, again, are his work. He recognized that that was going to take forever, and that he was really interested in the wagons and the tents and the logistical side. And so it's one reason he started building such a tremendous collection of photographs, is he would then take these photographs to individuals. And I should note that we have captured those names wherever possible as additional makers to the records that Walker's working with. And so he would take, a photo of a woman in the dressing tent pulling on a boot to one of his sculptors, and they would make that figure, and he would place it where he imagined it. On the midway, and in those areas where it's large crowds, like Emily was referring to, those are largely manufactured figures. Howard initially found a company out of Germany that sold people at just the right scale for his model, which was important that it be 1/16 life size. And so he ordered these figures. Now they all came dressed alike, which was not okay with Howard. So he sewed clothes for some of them, or had some people assist him with sewing clothes. He painted some of them. He would sometimes shave off the hair so that he could have a bald figure. So there really is not much of anything in the model that Howard did not touch in some way to make it very specific for the world that he was creating.
Thank you, Jennifer. And we have another question. John is saying he loves the book on the model that's available. Is there a plan to write another with more information like this? And for our audience that is not familiar, we have a great book on the model. It's available in the museum store, I believe, right, Jennifer?
Yes, it is. And I didn't think to have a copy right in front of me, darn it. But it has always been talked about, with Debbie Walk, when she was the curator, when Howard installed the model. We discussed the fact that that book is kind of just an introduction, an overview of what it is, and that the model is a great opportunity to explore the richness of all the circus collections. So it's certainly something that we would like to do one day. As you can tell just from talking about just the circus model. There's so many opportunities that we just have to kind of keep working through them. So the nice thing is, again, with more staff coming on board and engaging with the model, I think we'll find richer ways to tell those stories. Thank you for sharing the picture. John has the picture of the model book. Thank you. I appreciate that. He's a good pitchman. We could put you on the circus lot. I am happy to take any more questions, but I do know we've run a little. Oh no, we haven't run terribly long, have we, Laura? We're doing good.
Perfect. Any last opportunity? Anyone else would like to ask a question? You can just unmute yourself if you would like.
I just wanted to say what a wonderful program this was, and I look forward to part B so that we can hear more wonderful stories about these performers. I just really love the stories about the clown and the equestrian performer. It really personalizes the whole model so much more.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you, Ingrid.
All right, well, thank you to Jennifer, Walker, Glenn, and Emily for a fantastic presentation. It's always such a pleasure to hear from all of you. And it sounds like there is demand for a part B, so we'll talk about that soon.
Fantastic. Thank you all again for spending some time with us. It's been fun to do this program, and thank you to my colleagues who are part of this, because it is nice. It means a lot to me to have an institution that's full of people who get as excited about the model as I do.
Thanks, Jennifer. Thanks,
Have a great
everybody.
day, everybody.